Technical tips from my boyfriend. In a previous video, I highlighted 12 factors you should be controlling in Unreal Engine at the beginning of every project if you want to create a cinematic film look. That video is a nice high-level summary, but for now we will be diving into the technical clicky things you need for the first 11 factors in my list. So let's set up Unreal's plugins before we tackle the first factor. Go to the Plugins menu, Plugins, Movie Render Queue, on. Plugins, Movie Render Queue, Additional Render Passes, on. Apple ProRes Media, on. Okay, let's walk through the 11 factors. Number 1, lock in your viewport to the film rate. Go to the command line prompt. Unfortunately, this needs to be done every time you restart Unreal. T.max FPS 24, assuming a 24 frame per second output. Number 2, anti-aliasing for smooth visuals. Type r.temporal AA.upsampling 64 or type r.temporal AA.upsampling 1024. The movie render queue does a calculation for anti-aliasing. For example, 15 times the render setting. So 15 times 64 equals 960. And this result is, as should be, below the upsampling, or 1024, as typed in the second previous example. One note, the samples must be odd. So, for the upsampling of 64 in the first previous example, I'd use a movie render queue of 1 anti-aliasing samples, or 15 for the 1020 upsampling example. I'll take a deeper dive into the render settings in its own video, which I reference as the 12th factor. Having said that, we will be controlling the next 3 factors using the Project Settings menu. Open Project Settings. And now, number 3, disabling auto exposure. Default settings, auto exposure, off. Default settings, auto exposure method, manual. Default settings, auto exposure bias, 0. To test your results, view your scene through a camera actor, not the viewport perspective viewer. Number 4, harness lumen reflections. Cinematic global illumination lighting. Software ray tracing, generate mesh distance fields, on. Global illumination, dynamic global illumination method, lumen. Reflections, reflection method, lumen. Reflection capture resolution, 128 or super high or low. Project settings, search for fog, support sky atmosphere, affecting height, on. This will fix harsh transition between sky and ground. Number 5, reducing system crashes. On many processors I use, there is still a defect between Unreal Engine and the 12th version of DirectX. I changed my default RHI to DirectX 11. Keep in mind, whenever there was an update, I noticed that Unreal Engine reverts my RHI back to DirectX 12. So remember to make this one-time change after any updates. Project settings, default RHI, DirectX 11, DirectX 11 and 12, SM5, on. Okay, our plugins and settings are done. Let's begin by creating some environmental objects or actors. Number 6, creating an environmental sun system. Creating directional light. This will be the sun source. Set all lights to movable. Create a skylight. This will provide indirect global illumination for lumen. Set it to movable. Details, light, Real-time capture on. Creating atmospheric effects. Create sky atmosphere from the visual effects sub-menu. Create exponential height fog from the visual effects sub-menu. Exponential height fog component. Fog in scattering color, change color to black. Directional in scattering color, change color to black. Volumetric fog on. Create volumetric cloud from the visual effects submenu. Plugins, volumetric plugin, play with layer height 0.1. Play with a life shaft bloom on. Change cloud materials. Unreal has a number of default clouds built into the system. However, the folder to these clouds may be hidden. So, Content window, Settings, Show engine content, and Show plugin content. In Content window, navigate to All, Engine, Plugins, Volumetric content, Content, Sky, Materials. Click on materials you want to try, i.e. 02. In Outliner, select the volumetric cloud. Cloud material, material. Click the semicircle back arrow. This is the button that pastes whatever was mouse selected in the previous step. Number 8, 9, 10, and 11. The final factors to control can be set with different values using different cameras. But for our example of a baseline setup in Unreal, we can use the post-process volume to create a universal object that will control all of the final 4 factors in one place across your scene. The final 4 factors are film grain and vignette, motion blur, lens flares, and ray traced reflections. Create post-process volume from the visual effects submenu. Scale box to encase the scene. Global illumination. Method, lumen. Reflections, method, on, lumen. Lumen, reflections, quality, play with 2 or above. Lumen reflections, ray light mode, project defaults, or hit lighting for reflections. Lumen global illumination. Final gather quality, 4. Ray tracing reflections, max bounces, 2. Samples per pixel, 8. Post-process volume settings, infinite extent, unbound, on. To apply post-processing to everywhere in the scene and not just the little box, turn off auto exposure in post-process volume. Exposure, metering mode, manual. Exposure compensation, play around. The default viewer has built-in auto exposure. The camera actor used the post-processing manual exposure settings. Film grain or vignette or motion blur or lens flares. Again, this can be done per camera, but we'd adjust here for universal options. Number 1, film grain. Post-process, film grain. Film grain intensity, 0.5. Number 2, vignette. Post-process, image effects, vignette intensity, 0.5. Number 3, motion blur. Post-process, motion blur, 0.5. Number 4, lens flare. You're welcome. Let's use textures. In post-process volume or in camera bloom. Install a convolution pack. Convolution packs are textures that mimic the look of light blooms in your camera. There are different packs with different prices and installation procedures. Some are available for free with a quick search on things like Bloomify. I'll illustrate one of the common convolution bloom packs. Method, convolution. Intensity, 0.01. For no bokeh blades, higher if you want them, but downgrade the convolution scatter. Convolution scatter dispersion. 5.0 to compensate for lower intensity. Convolution kernel. Apply texture from the convolution pack. Search for bloom in the texture field. Fixing ray traced reflections. Look at the reflection item. Post-process, ray tracing reflections, max. Bounces, 2 or 3. Ray tracing reflections, samples per pixel, 2 or up to 32. Just watch out for falling FPS. Select directional light. Light, indirect lighting intensity, 10. And notice how the global illumination bounces off of walls to light the room based on the reflected sunlight. Directional light. Link directional light to sky atmosphere. Select directional light. Details. Atmosphere and cloud. Atmosphere sunlight. On. Turn on any other cloud effects you want, but do it when we create the volumetric clouds later. Rotation. To rotate the sun, hold Ctrl L and the mouse to GUI move the sun. Set all lights to movable. Move all lighting effects to its own .light controls folder. Alright, we now have a baseline cinematic environment for creating scenes that are filmic. This setup takes our shots from this to this. If you're familiar with cinematography, you now have a technical setup in the Unreal environment that will interact and render more photorealistic movies. You can save this project as a template for future projects when you want scenes that look like a Hollywood movie. But if you're not familiar with film set cinematography, my next video will cover factor number 12, where I will control lights and exposure like a cinematographer would on a real set. This will include all the render settings to create a film look print. Hit like and subscribe to be notified when that video gets uploaded. If you use any of these settings, let us know below what kind of projects you're working on. See ya! Oh.